The Chinese first arrive on the west coast of what becomes Canada at the same time that the British do. In 1788, British sea captain John Meares brought Chinese workers over from Canton, who built his fur trading post and sailing ship, the Northwest America, that actually established the British claim to the territory. And then Chinese people have been in Canada continuously since the 1858 gold rush, which was again 13 years actually, before British Columbia entered Confederation. Despite that, from fairly early on, they faced all sorts of legalized discrimination. Well, one of the first acts of the British Columbia legislature took the right to vote away from the Chinese and Indigenous peoples of British Columbia. At the time, Indigenous people were about 5 times the size of the settler population, and the Chinese may have been the next largest group. They were certainly the largest group in certain areas. In British Columbia, anti-Chinese racism and later anti-Japanese and other forms of racism were popular politics, and ultimately British Columbia enacted, through its history, 223 separate pieces of legislation that discriminated against the Chinese. That's 1 out of every 10 acts ever passed in the British Columbia's history up to 2014. By the time of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1923, Chinese are banned from voting in British Columbia and face considerable systemic discrimination. And at the same time, there's a widely held view that Canada was and should be a white man's country. So the Exclusion Act gets enacted in the same era, for example, that the federal government makes attendance at Indian residential schools compulsory. As we know, that's been found to be an active process of organizing the cultural genocide of Indigenous peoples. So it's in this context that the Exclusion Act gets created. The Chinese Exclusion Act came into effect on July 1st, 1923. Which was Canada Day, called Dominion Day at the time. And to mark the event, across the country, Chinese Canadian communities organized on July 1st what they called Humiliation Day. Basically, what this involved is really prohibiting anybody from being involved in any celebrations of Canada's birthday. You couldn't, if you were a kid, you couldn't have a piece of cake if somebody was giving out a birthday cake, this kind of thing. And it was a way of sort of signifying that this is the day the Chinese were humiliated. To the best of our knowledge, between the time that the Exclusion Act is enacted, 1923, and its abolition in 1947, exactly 44 people of Chinese origins are admitted into the country. This meant that the majority of the Chinese in Canada, who were mainly men who were married and had families in China, this is as much as 87% of the population, could not possibly bring in their family members to join them. The majority of men were so-called bachelor workers. And I say so-called because the majority of men were not bachelors. They were just living separately from family members who were in China and trapped in China after the Exclusion Act. A lot of work done in Canadian history has focused on Europeans. It's been white people's history. And the what I call the grand narrative of Canadian history is about the country. History begins with Leif Erikson and, John Cabot, who actually spent all of a half an hour, I think, in Newfoundland. It doesn't begin with the indigenous people were here, but they were part of the scenery. And then the idea that Canada has a West Coast today because of its connections to China and because of the efforts of Chinese workers is just an alien idea.
It was the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Exclusion Act, and it's not well known in Canada. First within the Chinese community itself, Chinese Canadian community, but also in the mainstream writ large. So to commemorate the 100th anniversary, I felt that we needed something that was substantive. There was a debate as whether we should do it in Vancouver or elsewhere, because it was in Vancouver where it was most felt. That we wanted to do it on Parliament Hill. But of course, Parliament Hill was under renovations that time, and so we decided to try and get it into the Senate of Canada, but not just in the Senate foyer, but in the chambers. To recognize it, but also to undo it, we needed to do it inside the Senate, where it actually happened, where senators spoke up, stood and spoke in that chamber for the act, to now have people stand up and speak against the act. The desired outcome was a national commemoration to start, but to also have parliamentarians understand this is what we can happen if we're not careful, that it should never be allowed to happen again. So one of the things that we wanted to do was to make sure we had a plaque, and we did that with thanks to Heritage Canada. We got that plaque, but I wanted it to be a living memorial, that when you walk into Parliament and you're going to work, the bill that you're considering, the act that you're debating, has impact on people. You see, when we first came, when the Chinese people first came to Canada and landed in Nootka Sound in the 1800s, it was the Indigenous people who saved them, who gave them comfort, who gave them food, and taught them how to live on that land. So we actually have, we have a very strong obligation, strong relation with Indigenous populations, and we need to also honor that. And so that was part of the Exclusion Act, and that's why when you watch the programming, it was very important that we recognize, and we wanted to have a very strong start on recognition of our relationship with the Indigenous peoples. That was important.
I've been around enough of the world as a deputy minister and in other roles to know that the things that I've achieved in Canada probably wouldn't have been possible for me in an awful lot of other countries. And that says an enormous amount about Canada and what Canada is, what it believes, and what it's struggled with over time. And I think the first large group of immigrants to be in Canada who didn't look like everybody else were the Chinese. And that is the first group which Canada had the great conversations about how will we deal with people who look very different from us, whose culture is so profoundly different, whose language is so profoundly different, who people understood so little in comparison to what they understood of sometimes other immigrants from Europe and other places. We've come an enormous distance in 100 years. Behind me is a certificate that said my birth grandfather could not come into the country unless he paid $500. And that was $500 that was supposed to keep him out of the country. And because the $500 that he was supposed to pay wasn't good enough at keeping him out of the country, 7 weeks to the day after he arrived, they put a law in putting an absolute end to that at all. 85 years and 10 months and some days after he arrived, I got named Deputy Minister in the Government of Canada, one of the most powerful positions you can get to in the federal public service, and the support and respect of Canadians coast to coast to coast. Sometimes it gets really specific though. The greatest game on earth, as far as I'm concerned, is the game of hockey. There are very few Canadians that don't love the game of hockey. But hockey effectively had a color barrier in it for a very long period of time. The very first person of color who wasn't Indigenous to break that barrier was a player by the name of Larry Kwong. Larry Kwong is the person who first made it to the NHL. He was only there for one game, but boy was he a fantastic player. And even in the playing of that game, having the determination to continue, not being stopped by the racism and discrimination that played such a big part of being a barrier to him excelling as well as he could have in the world of hockey. His continuation of that, and by comparison too, the willingness of many Canadians to say if he's good enough, he deserves a chance, that changed this country. That changed this country for the better, and not just in the world of hockey.
I'm a fifth generation Chinese Canadian, and when I found out about the head tax, it was after I had graduated university, and I had gone through the entire, school system without hearing anything about this history. And, I'm also mixed race, so I realized that, the head tax history touched one side of my family, while, you know, the white side or the European side of my family was literally given free land to be here in Canada and welcomed here with open arms, you know, at the same time as my kind of Chinese family was, you know, all these laws were enacted to essentially ban them from even entering into the country. So, you know, it was something that marked me when I discovered this history. And also, you know, at the time I was just beginning my career to be a filmmaker. I actually wanted to make fiction films, but the National Film Board had a kind of competition for emerging filmmakers of color. And when I heard about this story, I thought, you know, this would be a great topic for a documentary film, because if don't know about this history, I'm sure there's other folks who also don't know about it. So much of what we understand Canada to be, what we understand the history of this country to be, is really told from a white European lens. You know, there are, you know, certain people are seen to be the founders of the country, you know, and completely disregarding the fact that, you know, Canada as a territory, as a colonized place, there were Indigenous people who have been here since time immemorial. And also there are lots of different communities of color that also contributed, you know, to the building of the country, to the settlement of all the areas of Canada. You know, Montreal's Chinatown is literally the last Francophone Chinatown in all of North America. It's always seen as a tourist place. It's always seen as a foreign place for some reason, and it's literally the second oldest neighborhood in Montreal after the old port. Part of getting rid of the notion of the perpetual foreigner is really integrating our story into the narrative of the country. You know, storytelling is not just about telling stories, it's about staking your place in history.
I'm from northeast of China. I'm from Liaoning province. If I go to, let's say, Shenzhen, Guangdong, right? The people treat you probably a little bit different, okay? But if you want to get the respect, you better behave yourself, right? So my theory maybe is, okay, if you want to be respected by other people, you better do the things, you have to make sure you respect yourself first. That's why it doesn't matter if you go to university or go to my first job, take my first job, I still keep that in my mind. If you do something, I should do something better. Not just for myself, maybe for my whole family, or even for, you know, whole Chinese community. Sometimes if you want people to accept you, maybe we can be open from our mind first. Okay, maybe we should ask ourselves, like, do you really accept the people the same? Or do you think, oh, I'm a Chinese? From the deep mind, we're constantly say, I'm a Chinese, then a little bit different. When you think about the things, when you're doing things, that'll be a little bit different, right? When you think, oh, I'm a Canadian, I'm the same thing. So when you do the things, when you're treating the people, you will be open. Then you will accept them first. Then they will accept you. So I think that's probably the one thing that we can do.
The best way I can describe it is like fighting in a fog. You don't know why you're not progressing, or why you've been stymied, or why you've been held back. But you know you have been. But sometimes you think it's a crazy world because you don't even know what to talk. You cannot put a finger to it, you cannot see it, you cannot name it. And therefore, it gets ignored. We must be self-aware. It's not just good enough to understand, be proud of the fact that you're Chinese Canadian. I think we need to understand who we are, what we can bring to this country, and how we're going to do it. How do I make Canada stronger as a Chinese Canadian? How can the fact that I'm here in Canada as a Canadian of Chinese descent, how does my presence make Canada stronger for everybody else? It's a legacy of two things. One, we all agree it should never happen again, but I would also add to that, we have to be vigilant that it does not happen again, because it can. You know, even though it may not be worded the same way, but the impact will be the same. Let us remember all those who fought their way through that, who still, despite the heavy blanket of exclusion placed on them, they still struggled to survive. They still fought to be heard. They fought for their place. They fought for their status. takes will, and I think it's important that we emphasize the all Canadian history taught. We have been weaned on a history that is one-sided by and large, and there's no need to blame anyone. It's the way it was, but we need to fully understand the impact of the Indian Act, the residential schools. We need to understand what happened with the Sikh community when they first tried to come, the Jewish community when they tried to come before the Second World War. Understand the Japanese internment, right? And there's some beautiful history there. It's not as if it's a history that we should be ashamed of, or a history that is not pleasant to hear.
We are not able to have what we have at this moment without them. That's for sure. They came here in such bad situation, and they paved the road for us. That is, we should always remember their contribution to the Canadian Chinese community.
The difference between 0 and 1 is infinitely greater than the difference between 1 and 2. When you're proving for the first time that something can be done that people used to think as laughable, used to think of as completely ridiculous or impossible or any of those other things, and once you prove that it can be done, the world is a different place. There is no point in time where human beings haven't had different ideas from each other, sometimes been afraid of each other, sometimes not understood each other, sometimes been suspicious of each other. But everywhere where human beings have taken the time to understand each other, the time to get more comfortable with each other, the time to work more closely with each other and collaborate and cooperate with each other, amazing things have resulted from that.
True leadership isn't about like me achieving the highest level of the CEO's office. It's about all the people I bring with me on the way there. To me, it's way beyond just breaking through the bamboo ceiling. It's really challenging the ways in which these structures, these ceilings, these board tables are designed. To not have our community here had the Exclusion Act, persisted. Canada wouldn't nearly be as interesting as we wouldn't have Chinatowns. Actually, I think it would be a lot of a more bland place, and a less inclusive place, a less interesting place. Canada has some of the most hyper diverse cities in the world, and that's because we did eventually open up immigration.
It's been 100 years since you legislated our discrimination. What has changed? Third, fourth, fifth generation still estranged. Our elders go to their deathbed still ashamed. Our young ones born in this country still constrained, still told to go home, still spit on at bus stops, still virus, still spies, still foreign interference. We have never been allowed people. But today we stand and we scream for every face that looks like me. Every kid who's ever pulled their nose bridge to make it taller. Every time they mocked us because our eyes are smaller. This is for our elders, both alive and remembered, for their lessons, the tough and the tender, for our full names, past and present. May they be pronounced and may they be respected. For every chink in the national fabric, every nip in the winter wind of prairie towns and northern hamlets coast to coast on stolen land, every small town jade garden and dragon cafe, every gentrified Chinatown and rusty railway, we are here. We have been here. Far longer than the past 100 years. So child, when they tell you to go back where you come from, tell them you come from elbow grease and laundry bleach, from broken English and MSG, hunchback elders and paper sons. You come from a history of resistance, backbones and persistence, resilience and commitment. Tell them you belong. Tell them we belong. Show them your hands. These are the same blistered fingers that once clutched railway hammers, that form fists and family alongside our native relations. Feet bound by tradition, but forever forging forwards in lockstep recognition that freedom comes towards us in 100 years. Let us not look back again and mark what's left undone, but instead how far we've come. the fights we have won, and the sum of our people standing proud and equal. The past is the past, let this be the sequel. No longer ashamed and no longer illegal, but proud, unrelenting, and home.